Prayers are to be read by the member from East End.
Let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power derive, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our Sovereign Lady Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of the Cabinet, ex-officio members, and members of the Legislative Assembly, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. Proceedings are resumed.
Administration of oaths or affirmations. Oath of affirmation due execution by Mr. Strand Ashton Bodden, Acting Honourable Deputy Governor, responsible for the portfolio of civil service, to be the temporary ex-officio member of the Legislative Assembly.
Mr. Bodden.
I, Strand Ashton Bodden, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will well and truly serve Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, and the people of the Cayman Islands in the office of ex officio member of the Legislative Assembly. I, Strand Ashton Bodden, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, according to law.
Strand Ashton Bodden, please take your seat. We welcome you as the temporary ex-officio member of the Legislative Assembly.
Oath of allegiance and due execution by Ms. Dawn Lewis, the Acting Honourable Attorney General, responsible for the portfolio of legal affairs, to be the temporary ex-officio member of the Legislative Assembly.
I, Dawn Lewis, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, according to law, so help me God. I, Dawn Lewis, do swear that I will well and truly serve Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors, and the people of the Cayman Islands in the office of ex officio member of the Legislative Assembly. So help me God.
Ms. Dawn Lewis, please take your seat. We welcome you as the temporary ex officio member of the Legislative Assembly. Please be seated.
Reading by the Honourable Speaker of Messages and Announcements.
Honourable members, I have two matters of note that I bring to your attention. Honourable members, today is Thanksgiving Day, and I extend these thoughts and blessings to you and your families on this, our Thanksgiving Day. A few things happened this morning. Early, as I did my devotion, some songs came to me, and I shared them with some members. The one that caught my attention most was Let There Be Peace on Earth by the Harlem Boys Choir. And then I watched a video from Darman about spreading rumors. I've sent it to some of you members, so please pass it on. This Thanksgiving Day, as the song says, let there be peace on earth. Would to God that in this world men would lay down their swords, take up their plowshares, and study war no more. As I went into my devotion, I must admit I fretted over what I have to do for my seniors' Christmas party. This is the 39th one that I will be holding. The expenses, and I, of course, had to fret about our children's playground. The kind minister has assured me that's in good hands. As far as my seniors' Christmas party, I got a note this morning from a very thoughtful, community-minded person who does give over and over to our community, gave a check for $3,500, that is. Our God is real good. Thought I'd share it with you on this memorable day, our Thanksgiving Day, for all the Lord has done for us. We will never cease to praise Him. Of note, honorable members, with much sadness this morning, I note the passing of one of Cayman's foremost citizens, Mr. Arthur Berkeley Clifton Hunter, a worthy Caymanian who gave to his country his service in government as a civil servant, was a pioneer in the field of business and the legal profession, as he and his father, who was a notable legislator himself, notably steering the 1972 Constitution, developed the firm Hunter and Hunter. Nov Applebee's. Mr. Hunter gave personally to many, many worthy causes in the Cayman Islands and chose to be anonymous at all times. In 1984, he was part of the team that won the government, although he did not win his seat. Most of us won ours. And we worked with him on several matters over the years. Over the years, I personally know, in the early days, that he developed much legislation and assisted with much legislation of the government or for the government of the day. So I extend on behalf of my brother, who was a good friend of Mr. Hunter, and my other family members, our sincere condolences to his wife, his children, and all the other family members. I do so also, particularly to his only brother, my friend, Mr. George Hunter, and his family. I suspect at this time some members might wish to take time to do the same.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great sadness and abiding sense of loss that I rise to say a few words on behalf of Mr. Arthur, as most of us called him, and to publicly express condolences to his dear wife, Karen KK, as we've known her, his daughter, Desiree, and his son, Brian, who now heads up Applebee's. As life would have it, Mr. Speaker, 2 nights ago, by chance, I spent almost 3 hours with Brian. We talked about Mr. Arthur. We compared notes about our fathers, both of whom are not in good health. And talked about our children, roughly the same age. And he was very optimistic about his father's prospects following the heart surgery. So it was with the deep shock this morning that I awoke to the news that Mr. Arthur had passed suddenly last night. Mr. Speaker, my family is from Bordentown as well, and in fact we are distantly related on my mother's side, on my father's side, to the Hunters. So I've known them all my life. Mr. Arthur was, I believe, the first Caymanian to formally qualify as an attorney. Having done the all examinations and qualifying as a solicitor in Jamaica. And he came back to work. I hesitate to speak to years now because I haven't looked at this in a long time, but in the late 60s, I think it must have been around 67, 68, that he came back and joined his father, Mr. Clifton, who, like my grandfather, Alan, was a law agent and practiced here when there were very few formally qualified lawyers. From time to time, lawyers would come principally from Jamaica to deal with big cases, and they tended to be, in the good Cayman tradition, generally land wars or the occasional major criminal trial. But most of the other legal work was done by the law agents of that time. And together they built Hunter & Hunter into a major presence in the legal community here, with Mr. Arthur eventually retiring, but not before he had ensured that Brian had qualified as a lawyer and had been brought into the firm. And over time, the firm has, like most of the firms in Cayman, become, it's my word, internationalized. And Appleby, the firm now bears the name Appleby and is a continued legal force in these islands, growing from strength to strength. Mr. Arthur was also a Rotarian of real note, and I believe, again, that he was the first Caymanian district governor of Rotary. Over the many years that he served as a Rotarian, he did incredible amounts of community work and community service. In addition, as you have noted, Mr. Speaker, to the tremendous quiet contributions, financial contributions he made to many, many causes. Over the years, if you ever asked him for something, he gave it to you, he would swear you to secrecy, not to publicize from whence you got, or from whom you received the contribution. Mr. Speaker, when I was persuaded to stand for election the first time in 2000, Mr. Arthur was one of my strongest, not just supporters, but proponents. He was a member of the committee that worked to get me and the Honorable Kurt Tibbetts elected, but principally me. Kurt was a lock already. He spoke on my behalf on many a platform. He assisted me with speeches. I remember the very first speech that I had to make on the steps of the courthouse. Preparing for that, I was shaking like a leaf. And he made me present the speech to him 3 times before I went to the meeting. Those things I will always cherish, always be grateful for, and never forget. Over the many years that I have been in politics, this is now my 5th term, he has always been a staunch supporter of me, even when at times perhaps he didn't necessarily support the party, or there was at least one occasion I believe that to be the case, because he had strong views about things, and he always acted, as I am aware, in accordance with how he saw things and how he felt. There was no blind loyalty to anything. He was concerned always about Cayman and its future. He was quiet, soft-spoken, very intelligent and deeply insightful, and a wonderful person to have known, and one who made a huge contribution to the building of this nation. He was, Mr. Speaker, 81 years old. May God grant his family peace and comfort in the knowledge that her husband, their father and grandfather, was one of the true great Caymanians of his era. May God grant his soul peace and him eternal rest.
Mr. Speaker,
The Honorable, the Leader of the Opposition.
I too, on behalf of myself and the members of the opposition, wish to endorse all of the appropriate words that have been said about Mr. Arthur Hunter by yourself and the Premier. I first met Mr. Arthur in, I think it was 1966, because Mr. Criddock used to park his bus under the guinea tree by the market, where Magnum is now. and Mr. Hunter worked in a little wooden building. That was before, I think, he joined his father in their law practice, because if I recall, that was where the clerk of the courts, right, he was clerk of the courts in the Cape Man Island. And even then, he had a genuine concern about us children, and in his own quiet way, he would encourage us to be good boys. And you will recall, Mr. Speaker, when you and I first came into this house in 1984, and we set about moving the first private member's motion against the government that we supported. It was Mr. Arthur to whom we turned in his office to assist us in drafting the motion. Then his offices were right across the street in the Hunt Law building. As you said earlier, we had ran together in the '84 election, and most of us were profoundly disappointed that he didn't win his seat, because we had already agreed that he would have been a member of the Executive Council at that time. And because he had always, and he has always had a determined yet quiet resolve, and in his own way contributing to keeping the good ship Cayman on an even keel and headed in the right direction. Those kind of people, and there are not too many of them are left around these days, have left a mark on this country that all of us should be grateful. My father and him worked very closely in the Rotary Club, and they always enjoyed their company, especially at Rotary. So I wish for his family God's blessings, comfort in this time of anguish and pain, and to his brother George, who is also a good friend of mine, I wish the same, and all of his children, and may his soul rest in peace. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to, through this medium and my other two colleagues, take the opportunity to extend to Ms. Karen, George, and the rest of the family deepest sympathies from the people of Savannah, whose constituents I represent, and knowing the family from way back when, having spent some quality time with both Mr. Arthur and Karen, it was a treat to hear him speak in his very knowledgeable manner. He was a no-nonsense person, and you knew where you stood with him. And today, Cayman has lost a tremendous anchor that has contributed to the stability of these islands. He will be missed in many ways, as my colleagues who have worked with him in the legal fraternity have demonstrated. But on behalf of my family and the people of Savannah, I would like to take this opportunity to extend our deepest sympathies to the family.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I only rise to give my sympathies to the family, though I'm one of the younger members of this honorable house and not as close as the senior members of this house with the family. But nevertheless, I want to, on behalf of the people of Georgetown Central, which I know many families of my constituency as well knowing of the Hunter family and their contributions in the community and to our life as a whole politically. So on that behalf, on the people's behalf of Georgetown Central, I give my deepest sympathies to the family, and I send prayers to above to allow them to deal with this sad situation as easy as it possibly can.
The member from Georgetown South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise to extend my condolences and mine of my family to Mr. Arthur's family, KK, Desiree, and Brian. We grew up in Crew Road. They actually were just up the road from us, so their family and my family were very close. In fact, my sister worked with Hunter & Hunter and now Applebee's for 35 years. So I just want to say I'm so sorry today for the family and just to extend my condolences to them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Financial Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have all heard the great man that Mr. Arthur Hunter was by the various contributions here today, and I certainly want to echo those sentiments and giving my deepest condolences to the immediate family, his wife, Miss KK, children, Desiree and Brian, and certainly his brother, George Hunter, who is a resident and constituent of the constituency that I represent, that I have the honor to represent, the West Bay South. And so certainly on behalf of myself as a representative, but more broadly, I'd like to also give my condolences on behalf of my mom, who knew Mr. Hunter in particular well, having worked at an establishment that he had a very close connection to for many, many, many years. And so I think I've known Mr. Hunter as long as as I've known myself, in the sense of growing up very much a part of that work family community. And so I remember seeing and interacting with Mr. Hunter as a child and straight on up, and I've always been very thankful for the words of encouragement, the words of congratulations, the words of wisdom that Mr. Hunter through the years have given to me at the various times that I've had the opportunity to interact with him throughout the course of my development, from childhood to young adulthood and now as a representative in these hallowed halls. So I want to say that the news, as I'm sure has shocked many of us in this community, my prayers and my deepest sympathies go out to all those who mourn the loss of this great citizen of this country, and whose memory will certainly live on through the work of his children, family, and the community that has been so touched in many obvious ways, as we heard through the contributions and quiet endorsements, as well as the more vocal and obvious contributions that he made while he was here on this earth with us. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too rise to say a few words, if you allow me to. Very sad day for me, Mr. Speaker, to get up this morning and hear the news of Mr. Uncle Arthur's passing. This country's lost an icon. I've lost a very dear friend, a man who I've known literally all of my life. He and my father were our best friends. And growing up, all I ever knew him as was Uncle Arthur, and his wife was Aunt KK. And we are not related, but it was because of that closeness and relationship that my family enjoyed with him that we addressed them and addressed him as such, out of sheer love and respect. I've mentioned that just how close my family was. We vacationed together. If my parents had to be off island, we were sent to stay and live with Aunt KK and Uncle Arthur. And similarly, when they had to be off island, their children came and stayed with us. He was one of the first peak Caymanians that I know of that had property bought property in the Rum Point area, late 60s, early 70s. And every Easter, every opportunity we had as children growing up, we camped out at Rum Point on his property. So I feel a very deep sense of loss, and through really this medium to express publicly my deepest condolences and sympathies to Aunt KK, Desiree, Brian, and to his brother George on his untimely passing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Georgetown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise to offer my sympathies and the sympathies of my family to Ms. KK, Brian, Desiree, George, and the whole family. I was also asked by my sister to pass on condolences on behalf of her and Jerry Kirkconnell, whose family were very close to the Hunters. And I remember from days, I was always a good child growing up, but there was a few times I stepped off the road, you know, and when we were in by right, there was a few times I had to walk down to his, there was a few times that I had to walk down, excuse me, sir, sorry, Mr. Speaker, but I had to walk down from by right to, as the opposition leader said, to the office right across the road here where Mr. Hunter's office was to speak to Dave Rich. So I used to be able to go in there and see Mr. Arthur, and over the years we became pretty close. And I've reached out to Brian already this morning to pass on condolences to the family, but I would just like to say it publicly and also from the Kirkconnell family. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers and reports. Office of the Auditor General, Cayman Islands, Government's use of consultants and temporary staff, February 2018. Report of the Standing Public Accounts Committee and the report of the Auditor General's Government's use of consultants and temporary staff, February 2018. Report of the Standing Public Accounts Committee and the report of the Information and Communication Technology Authority 2015-2016 accounts, to be laid on the table by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, the elected member for Northside, Chairman of the Standing Public Accounts Committee.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of this Honourable House the Auditor General's report, Government Use of Consultants and Temporary Staff, dated February 2018. The report of the Standing Public Accounts Committee on Government's Use of Consultants and Temporary Staff, February 2018. And the report of the Public Accounts Committee on the Auditor General's report, Information and Communications Technology Authority, 2015-2016 accounts.
So ordered.
Questions by the Honourable Ministers and members of the Cabinet. The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask the Honourable Minister of District Administration, Tourism and Transport. Question number 35.
Honourable Premier, we have passed the hour of 11 a.m.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 23, 7 and 8 in order that questions may be asked of ministers after the hour of 11 a.m.
Question is that standing orders be suspended in order for questions to be asked after the hour of 11 a.m. All in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question on the order paper labeled number 35, standing in my name. Can the Honourable Minister say if there is a moratorium on issuing taxis, tours, or bus operator licenses, and if so, why?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier, Minister of District Administration, Tourism, Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, there is no moratorium on taxi licenses. The Public Transport Board, based on demand, reviews applications every 12 months and issues permits for all categories of public transport services. The Public Transport Board takes into consideration the supply and demand of all categories of public transportation to ensure that there's adequate supply to meet market demand. Thank you.
Supplementaries, the member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister say if that position is in line with the position previously stated by another member of his cabinet in a previous answer in the last sitting of the House, which stated, and I am reading, Mr. Speaker, from a previous answer by the Honourable Minister Joey Hugh, which stated, we operate, and let me start the whole paragraph. It says, Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member of Georgetown Central is aware, we operate in a free enterprise economy where Caymanians are free to own and operate a business for profit in a competitive system. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member has just suggested where there's not freedom of choice to just get it when they want it, like a business license, like the previous minister has suggested. Does the minister see the conflict in that position and the position of his colleague and minister?
Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I don't really see a conflict in the way that the minister responsible for Commerce answered the question. I believe that it's incumbent upon the government, whichever government it is, to make best effort for the economic development of the country that they have been chosen by the people to represent and have an obligation to provide opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the opportunity that the regulatory bodies of the government has in a long myriad of services is to balance how we work in a competitive environment. And I want to make it extremely clear that tourism, taxi, tour is a very competitive industry that competes regionally in the tourism market and in offering a service to a country. So the way that the taxi licenses and tour operators are awarded or granted is when applications are made, they are reviewed, and based on supply and demand of what the country needs, they are granted. And I give the example just as a point of reference for when the last large issuing of licenses for taxis was when the Kimpton came online. And I think the member from Georgetown Central would agree that because of the number of rooms and the increase in the tourism market, that there was demand for more and opportunity for more. So it is monitored, and through best practice, try to make sure that
the balance of providing that service maximizes the ability of the people who are providing the service to be successful in that industry.
Member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Forgive me for trying to wrap my head around the answer that the minister gave me, but what I understood, and if the minister can clarify, is he's saying that you can regulate the tourism industry, but you can't regulate any other industry in the Cayman Islands.
The Honorable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I think there are, when you look at opportunities and economic benefits, I did my best to explain the reasoning and the thought process behind monitoring a service that is made available to the public and to the tourism industry.
Last supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I ask if
Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, I ask if you give me the privilege to allow more than just one, because I think we need to get to the bottom of this matter, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member, I will give some latitude as it's other members that wants to ask the question that I had said was the last supplementary. Try to wrap as many of your supplementaries into one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or two.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member.
The Honorable Premier made me forget what I was going to ask now. Strategy. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think that car washes is a competitive industry and whether or not they should be regulated, and what is the difference between them and transport in respect to competitiveness and opportunity for a Caymanian to be involved in that? Because, Mr. Speaker, the member should at least accept that it's not a free market approach like suggested by the former minister that they're taking now, because they're controlling the market.
The Honorable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to go back to my original answer, and I'm hoping that I can explain it to the extent that the member will understand, as he said, wrap his head around it. So the first part was I brought in the regional competitiveness of what happens in a tourism economy. And that is that when you have one pillar of your economy that's based on visitors, the experience that they expect and the experience that they need for them to continue to be repeat visitors and people that support the country itself, is that we don't want a situation that happens in other countries where when you look for some type of public transportation, let's say taxi, you have 5 or 6 people that come, drive up, very vocally try to get you in their vehicle. What has been the process that I came as minister and found in place was trying to provide the best service through a very not regulated process, but a thoughtful process of realizing that for the tourism industry, and we can speak about friends and family, but from that industry itself, there is an opportunity that is the touch point and ambassador to your island. A taxi operator is Caymanian to be allowed to get and apply to get a taxi license. They take a pride training course, they take a test, and they are put on the road and it's looked at to meet supply and demand.
The Honorable the Leader of the Opposition.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Tourism, can the Minister confirm that these licenses are only given to Caymanians?
Yes, sir, I confirm.
Premier.
I can confirm the question.
Are the Caymanian, can the Minister say if Caymanians, having received the license, are then allowed to hire non-Caymanians as driver and operate the vehicles?
The Honorable Deputy Premier.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, let me thank the member for the question. A taxi operator must be a Caymanian when they're driving the taxi. That's the law. A tour business must be owned by a Caymanian, but they're allowed to apply for permit drivers if there's a need.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yeah, and when you say that tour buses, that includes what we know as public, the ones that drive around with public bus on them. Are Caymanian owners of those allowed to hire non-Caymanians to drive them?
And member, the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, sir, that is correct.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Can the member explain what is the point then of requiring a Caymanian to have the license if a non-Caymanian, some of whom speaks very funny languages and are very aggressive and everything else, to operate the vehicle? But it could be 6 to 4, or it could be,
The Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, how to use the terminology from the member from Central. I'm trying to get my head around the question. This is a business that a Caymanian saw an opportunity and wanted to open, and in doing business, he had a need to apply to advertise for someone, and he didn't have a Caymanian that responded to the ad. He made an application through immigration and got a permit.
Last supplementary goes to the member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister say, or is the minister saying that it's okay to control a market and industry in respect to transport, but not okay to control the market or the industry with any other industry in the Cayman Islands?
Honorable Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to try to make this again as clear as I can. We believe that there's a responsibility that a government has to create opportunity. The opportunity is for the country itself. I have taken my time and explained the benefit of having a A-plus service for the population and for the people.
The elected member for Georgetown Central to ask Honourable Minister of Human Resources, Immigration and Community Affairs, question number 36.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to ask the question on the order paper labeled number 36, standing in my name. Can the Honourable Minister say why does a visiting person with musical talent have to get an endorsement from the Music Association in order to have their work permit approved?
The Honorable the Minister of Human Resources. The Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the answer. The current provisions of the immigration law stipulate that when considering an application for the employment of an entertainer through the grant of a temporary work permit, the Chief Immigration Officer or his designate is required to take into account, where appropriate, the views of the Cayman Music and Entertainment Association and the Cayman National Cultural Foundation. This process serves to ensure that entities with intimate knowledge of the music and entertainment industry are able to provide an informed opinion on whether particular entertainers, which includes persons performing musical acts, singers, disc jockeys, comics or circus or carnival performers, are culturally suitable for local audiences. In addition to the work permit regime, the immigration law also has provision for a visitor work visa, a short duration, maximum of 5 days, work visa processed at the airport upon arrival. Requirements for the visitor work visa to be approved are for an invitation letter to be sent to the Department of Immigration by a local employer, and if approved, for the visitor work visa to be processed on arrival. Whilst the Cayman Islands Music and Entertainment Association were supportive of implementation of the work visa process, as it allowed for an efficient process when bringing in foreign musicians and entertainers for short-term engagements. Ultimately, the visitor work visa process does not provide a mechanism for the association to provide feedback on foreign entertainers, effectively bypassing the music associations, the Music and Entertainment Association's consultation that is required for the other work permits. Mr. Speaker, the government acknowledges the importance of engaging with industry stakeholders, such as the Music Association and CNCF, and recognizes the value that such stakeholders can create with respect to the decision-making process for work permit applications. As the government progresses with the establishment of workforce opportunities and residency Cayman, the work agency, for which we passed the initial legislation early in this meeting, further discussions with the Cayman Islands Music and Entertainment Association will help to shape the processes for work permits and work visas to ensure that those applications are administered from a more informed position to ensure Caymanians have fair opportunities. Mr. Speaker, I can add that the whole process of work permits and the types of work permits that are granted is under review, and those are likely to be dealt with in the upcoming legislation, which I alluded to when I presented the work bill earlier in this meeting. So I can say to the member that really anything further that I say will be subject to whatever final decisions are taken about these various processes as we move to create new regulations and perhaps even new primary legislation dealing with the whole work permit categorization.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier highlighted a very important point, Mr. Speaker, that the fact that the immigration law has now been repealed. How does the Okay, Mr. Speaker, I just got some clarification that it won't be appealed until the other legislation come into place. So I'll continue on with my second supplementary. Mr. Speaker, is the Premier aware of any policy position by past administration that goes on further than what the Premier has said in paragraph 2 of his answer, that says the process serves to ensure that entities with intimate knowledge of the music and entertainment industry are able to provide an informed opinion on whether particular entertainers, which includes all the various ones he just highlighted, are culturally suitable for local entities. Now that is part of it, Mr. Speaker, but is the Premier aware that the other policy position on why they had to get an endorsement by the Music Association was to ensure that our local talent by way of music and dance and entertainment had an opportunity to get exposure in any events here locally? Is he aware of that?
The Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if I'm aware of all of that detail, but I know the whole purpose behind the consultation process was to obtain the views of the respective associations and to enable the board to perhaps even impose conditions on the permits that were granted, that you will get the permit if you allow local entertainment or so on, so on, so on.
Certain things. A member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Premier say whether that exact position that he just suggested will also be included in new legislation to make sure that the music talent and entertainment talent locally still gets the opportunity for any event here to get exposure?
Mr. Speaker,
Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I can't say that. I was at pains to say that the whole thing is being reviewed, and it is premature to ask those questions at this stage. When the bill comes, then is the time to know what it is that is being proposed. But the whole process that we're going through involves consultation, because we're trying to shape the new legislation to address, after all of these years of experience we have with these things, to see if we can get a better system, which is efficient, but at the same time allows for appropriate consultation with the necessary stakeholders to ensure, because that's the whole premise of the work permit regime, to ensure that where there are suitable Caymanians who are willing and able to engage in whatever their activity is, that they have an opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I probably won't carry it much further, because the Premier is 100% correct. When those discussion comes up in the further legislation, we can discuss how to ensure those provisions are in place. But Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to set a foundation of what is currently in place, so when we get to that argument, I know how to argue my point. So I'll ask the last two supplementary questions and we move from there. Work with me. Can the Premier say whether he's aware of a policy that allowed for payment to the Music Association by the way of endorsement, and that it was seen as a way to fundraise for the Music Association so they can do the necessary things that they need to do to run the organization and give opportunities to the membership of the Music Association?
Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that resulted in some very unhappy situations. I'm not going to go any further than that. When you introduce money being paid by people who want to perform here to an association, without government having any oversight of it, all sorts of unfortunate things can occur.
Last supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Georgetown Central.
I appreciate what the Premier has said, and he's 100% correct. We got to be very careful with respect to money. So I'm not going to challenge him in respect to that. But I think, Mr. Speaker, what I would like to ask is, I think that the Premier recognizes that it is a way to raise funds for the association to expose young Caymanian talent to the industry in various different ways. If that loss of opportunity for revenue is gone, because I can tell that the Premier plans to move that away based on his response, where do you think, where does the Premier intend to replace those funds that is necessary for the association to do what they need to do to give young Caymanan talent exposure, because it costs money to run the association and do the various other things for young talent?
Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there is no obligation on the part of government to fund associations which are private entities. But over the course of many years, governments, not just the one I have the honor and privilege to lead, have made grants to many, many different associations to help with a whole range of things. But this business of an association charging for consultation, $200 every time government consults with them about, is beyond ridiculous, and the practice will not be allowed to continue. I better stop before I say some other things.
Clerk, can you please, next item.
Statements by the Honourable Ministers and members of the Cabinet.
I have two statements. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to provide members of this Honourable House and the general public an update on government's efforts to make important and necessary revisions to the Cayman Islands Constitution Order 2009. Before doing so, Mr. Speaker, I will provide some background for the benefit of the public and for members of this House, for it's been some time since I last addressed this issue. Mr. Speaker, we will recall that in May this year, the House of Commons attached an amendment to the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Bill that was making its way through the United Kingdom Parliament. The bill, with the amendment, was passed by the Commons and later by the House of Lords. This amendment requires the British Overseas Territories, but curiously not the Crown Dependencies, to establish public registers of beneficial ownership and to do so no later than the 31st of December 2020. Failing this, the amendment requires the United Kingdom government to utilize an order in council to change our local legislation to implement a public requirement of a public register of beneficial ownership. Mr. Speaker, I have said many times since the amendment passed in the UK Parliament that the Cayman Islands does not accept that the United Kingdom Parliament has the right to legislate for us when it comes to domestic matters that are already devolved to local government by virtue of our constitutional order. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we view this as a constitutional overreach by the UK Parliament, a view that is shared by our constitutional advisors in the UK and also stated by several law lords during the debate in the House of Lords in May this year. Mr. Speaker, this constitutional overreach is concerning, and not just because of the public beneficial ownership issue it is trying to force on us. It is also concerning because with the UK Parliament now believing that it can legislate for us in a fashion that, based on long-standing constitutional convention it previously accepted it should not, the Parliament may feel emboldened to do so again in the future on any number of matters that it sees fit. The vote in the Commons in May, Mr. Speaker, represented a line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. And so when I was in the UK in May this year, I met with both Prime Minister May and David Liddington, the de facto Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for the Cabinet Office and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And I also spoke with Lord Ahmed, the Minister of State for the Overseas Territories, on this matter. As a result of those discussions and subsequent official written requests, the UK government did agree to engage in constitutional discussions with the Cayman Islands government. However, a date to begin these talks was awaited. Mr. Speaker, I also had several discussions with my colleague, the Leader of the Opposition, on this matter. And I met with him and a number of the other members of the opposition about what we were considering in regard to constitutional safeguards. As I had said to this House in June this year, Mr. Speaker, the government and the opposition are of one mind in the need for these safeguards, and the proposals were supported. I will say again what I said then, Mr. Speaker. I am appreciative of that support and for the bipartisanship displayed. It is important that we in this House are fully in agreement on this very important matter. And Mr. Speaker, I would also remind the House that the opposition leader and I met with the Constitution Commissioner to discuss these matters, and I received a response from the Commission on these and other subjects. The Honourable Attorney General has also provided feedback on the proposed enhancements that we are seeking to our Constitution. Mr. Speaker, the House will also recall that the Leader of the Opposition and I held a joint press conference in May where we spoke to this issue and advised the Caymanian public that in the collective view of the government and the opposition, there was need for us to request some necessary safeguards and enhancements to our Constitution. Our goal, and I believe everyone in this House would agree, is to put the Cayman Islands in the best possible position constitutionally to govern our own affairs, to resist constitutional overreach by the UK government and Parliament, and to continue to thrive and prosper as a modern, progressive, and successful democracy. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the majority of Caymanians and those resident here can agree with this. Because of this, Mr. Speaker, we in this House must ensure that local politics take a back seat as we strive to obtain what is best for our country and our people. As I mentioned in June when I last updated the House, the constitutional safeguards we are striving for are to have aspects of our Constitution clarified to ensure that the Cayman Islands government has autonomous capacity in respect of domestic affairs, and that the UK Parliament will not legislate directly or indirectly without consultation or in matters of domestic autonomy without the consent of these islands. This matches the objectives of the UK 2012 White Paper and endorses its balance between self-determination and the responsibilities of the United Kingdom government. And we believe, Mr. Speaker, that it should further be made clear that the UK's power over international affairs be confined to the enforcement and implementation of clear international obligations of the United Kingdom alone, and that it also be made clear that provided the Cayman Islands is not in breach of international standards, the power of international self-governance is absolute, and that the power of disallowance with respect to legislation passed by this Honourable House be removed, as is the case with the Gibraltar Constitution. So in broad strokes, Mr. Speaker, those are the main measures that we are going to be pressing for in terms of constitutional changes to prevent this sort of constitutional overreach which occurred in May from occurring in the future. Mr. Speaker, these proposals are not intended to secure the Cayman Islands' independence, nor is it our intention to usurp the UK's proper role in external affairs, or to attain a degree of autonomy beyond the accepted status of the Crown dependencies and in respect of some constitutional provisions of overseas territories such as Bermuda and Gibraltar. Instead, we want to ensure that we have autonomous capacity in domestic affairs. Mr. Speaker, for the past 6 months, we have been in conversation with the UK on beginning these constitutional discussions. However, there has been considerable back and forth on how to progress these talks. But I am, Mr. Speaker, this morning pleased to confirm to this House and to the public that the United Kingdom government has just last week agreed to such discussions to be held in London following the conclusion of the Joint Ministerial Council meeting, which will be held on the 4th and 5th of December. The dates proposed for the constitutional discussions are Friday the 7th of December for preliminary discussions, resuming on Monday 10th of December. Discussions will be held at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on King Charles Street, London. Mr. Speaker, I am happy to say that the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of Opposition have both agreed to be part of Cayman's negotiating team. Also accompanying me will be Government's Constitutional Advisor in London, Sir Geoffrey Jowell, QC, as well as the Honourable Tara Rivers, Minister for Financial Services and Home Affairs, and the Honourable Samuel Bulgin, QC, Attorney General, both of whom will also accompany me to the JMC meeting, the Joint Ministerial Council meeting, earlier in the week. Mr. Speaker, as this matter progresses, I will keep this House and indeed the country informed. I want, Mr. Speaker, further to reassure this House and the general public that before any final safeguards to our Constitution are agreed with the UK, the proposed constitutional revisions will be debated and voted upon in this House. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Georgetown Central, do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I stand on point, standing order 32 to ask a clarification question.
Matter to be clarified.
Yes. Can the,
only a matter of clarity.
Can the Premier say which members, or he said he met with a few of the members of the opposition about this discussion. Can he say which members of the opposition he met with?
Mr. Speaker, I met with all members of the official opposition.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister say, do the people of Georgetown Central are deserving of the right and opportunity to be involved in those discussions in respect to at least the meeting of what you had just recently to decide with the opposition what you guys are going to go and negotiate about? Because I know you didn't meet with the representative of Georgetown Central, and the people's voice of Georgetown Central will no longer be heard in respect to this very, very important matter. Now, Mr. Speaker, I hated to give a little bit of a tint.
You've asked the question.
Mr. Speaker, if you allow indulgence, I didn't want to make this matter be a negative one, but I'm concerned that the Premier has just forgotten about the people of Georgetown Central. They have a voice here too, and they've not been involved in the discussions at all.
A member.
Mr. Speaker, I will never forget about the people of Georgetown Central. I represented them for 16 years when the member now speaking was still in school. Mr. Speaker, no one is shutting anyone's voice in this House, especially that member. He speaks at every opportunity. There will be plenty of time to debate all of this. But, Mr. Speaker, the member from Georgetown Central, as I've said before, is neither fish nor fowl. He does not work with the opposition. He does not work with the government. So he has chosen the path of isolation. And I can't help him in that regard. If he wants to come and sit with me for me to explain to him what we are proposing in more detail than I have outlined here, I am more than happy to do so. But I have to work with the system and with the official opposition. That is what the UK wishes to see. If he chooses to live out there on his own, that's not my fault.
The statement from the The Honorable Attorney General. I don't have that either. Continue, Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section
Honorable member from
11.6.
East End. I don't know if you got moms where men look like, but look at me.
I tell you.
Honorable member, please allow the Premier to read the statement. When you become Premier, I will give you the same opportunity.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 11.6 of the Public Management and Finance Law 2018 revision, I wish to make a statement to members of this Honourable House regarding exceptional circumstances which were approved by the Cabinet for the Cabinet Office portfolio during the 12-month budget period, which will end on the 31st of December 2018. Mr. Speaker, during the 2018 financial period, Cabinet decided to celebrate the 60-year Diamond Jubilee of our Coat of Arms and Constitution, and the Cabinet therefore approved $525,000 in funding for the appropriation captioned CBO 20, Advice and Assistance to the Premier and Administration of the Premier's Office. Mr. Speaker, in 2018 and 2019, the Cayman Islands will be celebrating the 60-year Diamond Jubilee of our Coat of Arms and our Constitution, respectively. When the Coat of Arms was approved on May 14, 1958, this was the first time the Cayman Islands was provided with its own unique symbol of national pride. In the mid-1950s, when Jamaica started their national debate regarding independence, leaders in the Cayman Islands wrote to Her Majesty's government, making it clear that regardless of Jamaica's decision, the Cayman Islands wished to remain part of the United Kingdom. This decision eventually led to Her Majesty the Queen approving the Cayman Islands Coat of Arms on the 14th of May 1958, and 1 year later, on the 13th of May 1959, the first Cayman Islands Constitution order was approved at Buckingham Palace. Mr. Speaker, the project has been entitled Celebrate Cayman and functions similarly to the quincentennial celebrations with a dedicated project team, albeit on a much smaller scale. Mr. Speaker, it was therefore agreed by Cabinet that a 2-year national celebration commence in May 2018 to educate, engage, and excite both the community here on all 3 Cayman Islands, as well as in the United Kingdom, about the history, significance, and symbolism of the Coat of Arms and the Constitution. I am pleased to report that celebrations have been well underway with successful events held on all 3 Cayman Islands and in the UK. Mr. Speaker, during the 2018 financial period, Cabinet deemed it necessary to second a civil servant from the Cabinet Office as Chief Operating Officer to the Utility Regulation and Competition Office, otherwise known as OFREG. And in this regard, the Cabinet therefore approved $55,083 in funding for the appropriation in captioned CBO1, Development and Coordination of Government Policy. Mr. Speaker, Section 15.1 of the Utility Regulation and Competition Law 2016 enables the Cabinet to, quote, approve the appointment of any public officer in the service of government by way of secondment to any position on the staff of the office, unquote. Mr. Speaker, the Utility Regulation and Competition Office began operations under the Utility Regulation and Competition Law on the 16th of January 2017. The new regulator, known as OFREG, merged the regulatory entities Electricity Regulatory Authority and Information and Communications Technology Authority, along with a government department known as the Petroleum Inspectorate. OFREG was also empowered to regulate the water sector which was previously under the Water Authority. In addition, OFREG was tasked with a new regulatory function of regulating the fuels market. Mr. Speaker, as a new public authority, OFREG was having teething challenges, and Cabinet felt that a seasoned public servant with relevant senior management experience could contribute to addressing such challenges. Accordingly, this secondment was done to support and strengthen OFREG's governance and operations. Among other matters, the seconded individual will assist OFREG's Chief Executive Officer implementing Cabinet-mandated directives, including the official travel policy, the anti-fraud policy, a policy regarding offering or receiving hospitality, entertainment, or gifts, a procurement code of conduct, and procedural guidelines, Crown Estate matters, land valuation, acquisition, disposal, and exchange, including leases. Mr. Speaker, during the 2018 financial period, it was also necessary to increase appropriations to fund the regulatory function of OFREG in the fuel sector, and the Cabinet approved $1,150,000 in funding for the appropriation captioned URC 8, Monitoring and Controlling of Petroleum Products, Storage and Handling. Mr. Speaker, the regulation of the fuel sector was unfunded primarily as a consequence of the necessary regulatory fee mechanism not being established as anticipated. The transitional funding provision from the Ministry of Plahi, now the Ministry of CPI, was exhausted as of December 31st, 2017. This was in the form of the remaining 2016-2017 budgetary allocation of the former Petroleum Inspectorate under the Ministry of Plahi to the tune of $357,000. Mr. Speaker, OFREG then sought an increase in appropriations of $1.15 million to fund the regulatory function of OFREG in the fuel sector in this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, also during this period, and this has been highly publicized previously, it was necessary to provide equity investment to continue the operations of OFREG to address solvency, and the Cabinet therefore approved $1 million equity investment for the appropriation captioned EI 79, interim funding for continued operation of the Utility Regulation and Competition Office. Mr. Speaker, the Utility Regulation and Competition Office began operations under the Utility Regulation and Competition Law on the 16th of January 2017. The new regulator, known as OFREG, merged the regulatory entities Electricity Regulatory Authority and Information and Communications Technology, along with government department known as Petroleum Inspectorate. This is a repeat, Mr. Speaker, of what I said with respect to one of the earlier appropriations. Mr. Speaker, when OFREG was first established, it was anticipated that both the fuels and water sectors would be funded by regulatory fees imposed on the licensees of these sectors, but this has not yet occurred, as the appropriate regulations and fee regimes for these sectors have not yet been approved by Cabinet. I should say, Mr. Speaker, they have not reached Cabinet for approval. With no funding for the water and fuels regulatory functions and the late transfer of the Petroleum Inspectorate funding, OFREG ended financial year 2017 with an approximate $1.4 million deficit. To survive 2017, OFREG depleted reserves originally contributed by the ERA and the ICTA. Accordingly, OFREG began financial year 2018 in a weakened financial position and found itself at the end of the first quarter of 2018 with a loss of over $300,000 and sufficient cash only to last about 90 days. Without interim funding, OFREG was foreseen to become insolvent before the end of July this year. Mr. Speaker, OFREG therefore sought the $1 million in interim funding from Cabinet to continue operations for the remainder of financial year 2018. As I said, Mr. Speaker, this has all been highly publicized before and will come as no surprise to anyone in this House, but it will also be the subject of the supplementary appropriation bill when we go into Finance Committee on that later today, and members will be able to ask any further questions they wish at that point. Mr. Speaker, the above exceptional circumstances which were approved by the Cabinet for the Cabinet Office portfolio during the 2018 financial period did not result in any risks of non-compliance with the principles of responsible financial management set out in the Public Management and Finance Law.
I have received statements from the Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 11(6) of the Public Management and Finance Law 2018 revision, I wish to make a statement to members of this Honorable House regarding exceptional circumstances which were approved by Cabinet for the portfolio of legal affairs during the 2018 financial year that ends on 31st December 2018. Mr. Speaker, the exceptional circumstances required making changes to appropriations, which I will briefly explain. $62,812 for purchase of software. In order to provide robust document control and document management with respect to the revision and publication of the legislation of the Cayman Islands in 2018, the Portfolio of Legal Affairs, POLA, requested on behalf of the Law Revision Commission additional funding via Section 11, subsection 5 for the purchase of a legislative software system. The current statute book of the Cayman Islands legislation consists of approximately 900 pieces of legislation. Those numbers are increasing as the Cayman Islands government now produces approximately 50 to 60 pieces of new legislation per annum. This software would serve to provide ready access to the entirety of the statute book of the Cayman Islands legislation on a modern platform in keeping with global standards for access to legislation expected of a world-class financial center. The purchase of this system was necessary as there was no automated version control system for the legislative workflow. Neither was there any automated system capable of assisting with the verification of cross-references between and among individual pieces of legislation. This system would address the above. The anticipated cost of the software system was up to US $75,000 or CI $62,812. POLA's 2018 capital budget of $20,000 was insufficient to cover the purchase of software. Therefore, in accordance with Section 11, subsection 5 of the Public Management and Finance Law 2017 revision, POLA requested Cabinet approve additional funds to appropriation EL 34 in the amount of $62,812 for the purchase of a legislative software system. Mr. Speaker, the above exceptional circumstances which were approved by the Cabinet for the Portfolio of Legal Affairs during the 2018 financial year on 13th February 2018, along with the overall effect on the government's compliance with the principles of responsible financial management, can be found in the 2018 supplementary plan and estimates which was tabled in this Honorable House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Personal explanations?
None.
Obituary and other ceremonial speeches?
None.
Raising of matter of privileges?
None.
Other business? Private member motions. Private member motion number 6 of 1617. Motion to extend the Hague Intercountry Adoption Convention to the Cayman Islands. To be moved by the elected member for Bordentown West.
Member for Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think members would have received a slightly revised amendment to my original motion. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read private member. Sorry. I'd like to beg to move private members motion number 6 of 2018-2019 standing in my name. Whereas there are many Caymanians that are desirous of starting a family, and whereas there may be factors that prevent some families from extending the size of their families organically, and whereas there may be a limited number of children available for adoption in the Cayman Islands, be it therefore resolved that the government consider requesting the United Kingdom government to extend the Hague Convention on the protection of children and cooperation in respect of intercountry adoption to the Cayman Islands.
Is there a seconder?
Mr.
The elected member for Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second the motion.
The Premier.
Speaker, I'm not sure all members have a copy of the revised version. Oh, it's coming. Sorry.
He's passing there now. Can I have an indication from the mover? You think you will open and complete your opening by the 1 o'clock? We are going to suspend for the lunch break.